ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to join us this afternoon. I am delighted to welcome you to the latest instalment of the IISS Conflict Briefings. So these are a series of briefings that the Conflict Security and Development Programme has established, and each month we zoom in on a different conflict. We bring in our in-house analysts and our senior analysts to give you their insights from both their regional expertise and also from their monitoring work on our Armed Conflict Database. And I am very happy that today we have two absolutely outstanding analysts to talk us through the conflict in Libya. So to my immediate left is Dr. Umberto Profazio. Umberto is IISS's Libya analyst, and he is also the Maghreb analyst for the NATO Defence College Foundation, and he specialises in political developments, security and terrorism in Libya and in the broader Middle East. And to his left, we have Dr. Emile Hokayem, IISS's Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, and he specialises in political and conflict analysis in the broader Middle East. So I'm going to begin by asking Umberto to brief us on the key developments happening within Libya today, and then I'll be asking Emile to consider the wider regional influences that are going to affect Libya's conflict. After about 30 minutes, we're going to open the floor to Q&A. And please be advised that this briefing is on the record and we are being live streamed by webinar. Without any further ado, let's begin. Umberto, Libya's different political players are still struggling to exert serious authority over much of the country as we move through 2019. So can you please give us an outline as to how this struggle for authority is shaping the armed conflict?
Thank you, Nella. It's great to be here and talk about the Libya crisis. When I joined the Armed Conflicts Database in 2016, there were real hopes that the conflict in Libya was about to end. The government of national unity was just arrived in Tripoli, and after the climax that reached with the seizure of the city of Sirte, the Islamic State terrorist organizations was about to be defeated outside its core in the Levant. But there were structural factors that prevented this conflict to be resolved. The main issue for me is the fragmentation process that has been going on since 2011. This fragmentation process has not been reverted, and it started immediately after the revolution in 2011. After a National Transitional Council, we had the General National Congress after the elections in 2012. The regional events with the events in Egypt in 2013 deepened the divide between the revolutionary forces on one side and counter-revolutionary forces on the other. The year later, in 2014, the launch of Operation Karama and Fajr Libya plunged Libya into a second phase of the civil war. The fragmentation continued in 2015 with the Skirat agreement in Morocco that paved the way to the Libyan political agreement. In the next 2 years, Libya had three governments: the Government of National Accord and its Presidency Council in Tripoli, led by Fayez al-Sarraj, the Government of National Salvation, led by Khalifa al-Ghel and associated with the General National Congress, and the interim government affiliated with the House of Representatives in the eastern part of the country. Despite the fact that the GNS was gradually ejected from Tripoli in the next 2 years, the presence of the House of Representatives in Tobruk contributed to the regional divide inside Libya between Tripolitania in the west and Cyrenaica in the east. This has led to the presence of centrifugal forces in the country, and has left Libya suspended in a status where there are centrifugal and centripetal forces. The chaos inside the country has left a breeding ground for militias, armed groups, and terrorist organizations. Despite the fall of Sirte in 2016, ISIS regrouped around the city in Bani Walid, in the center part of the country in the Jufra region, and was able to stage sporadic attacks against checkpoints, units of the Libyan National Army, and likely oil pipeline. There are different estimates, conflicting reports about the number of ISIS militants in the country, but according to a recent UN report, there could be around 3,000 or 4,000 militants. ISIS is not the only terrorist organizations present in Libya. In the southern part of the country, there is also Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and it represents a formidable threat to Libya, even though it has maintained a low profile compared to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi organization. The fact that Hakim represents a serious threat forced the US Africa Command to increase the number of attacks in southern Libya, especially in the southwestern part of the country. This is just a brief explanation of how the conflict is still ongoing, and the transition from the Gaddafi's Jama area to the Libya statehood is still incomplete.
Great, thank you so much, Umberto. So you've mentioned this fragmentation of interests and this large number of militias, and this security situation is also being exacerbated by a lack of effective institutions. Can you just please outline the key threats from these armed groups and militias?
Sure. The ineffective central government, its inability to provide basic services to the population, and its inexistent hold on the ground paved the way for the presence of multiple actors and the proliferations of armed groups and militias, and represents a return to a local dimension for the Libyan political landscape. There are different armed groups and militias in Libya. Some of them you can see them on the infographic. The most famous are based in Tripoli. All of you probably know of the cartel militias that is composed of the Abu Salim brigades, the Bab al-Tajura brigade, Navasi brigade, Special Deterrence Forces, and Tripoli Revolutionaries Brigade. These were involved in the conflict, in the battle for Tripoli in August-September 2018. Despite the fact that most of these clashes occurred as the turf wars, the conflict in August-September was a conflict between insider and what I can call outsider militias. The insider militias were the militias that are taking advantage of their proximity to the government of national accord through corruptive practices, the war economy, the issuance of letters of credit, and the black market. They were able to appoint their members in the institutions, and the outsiders instead were militias that were ejected from Tripoli in different clashes between 2016 and 2017. In the eastern part of the country, we have the Libyan National Army that, despite the name, is considered by many observers as another militia. Is composed of armed groups, some of them with a considerable degree of autonomy. This fragmentation is also present in the southern part of the country, where we have to add also tribes, clans, and minority groups. The recent developments in the southern part show us how the tribal dynamics is an important factor. The recent offensive of the Libyan National Army in southern Libya could be explained only through this lens. Haftar had already tried to take control of Libya in 2018. He advanced towards Saba, and he tried to co-opt military groups there, for example, the 6th Infantry Brigade that is composed by Avlad Suleiman fighters. There are different Arab tribes in Saba. We have the Avlad Suleiman, we also have the Qaddafa, in Kufra we have the Zwai, there is the Tebu minority, and the Tuareg minority too. Haftar was more successful in January this year, as he was also able to take advantage of the conflict in the south. He announced that military operations to remove militias, foreign mercenaries from Chad, terrorist groups, and this counter-terrorism narrative that has also been successful in Derna and in Benghazi was also instrumental in his expansions towards the south.
Great, thank you so much. And alongside this proliferation of militias, we are seeing a number of security sector reform efforts underway. There is a demobilisation, disarmament and reintegration programme, and there's also a military reform programme. Can you please let us know what you expect from these efforts?
Yes, all this process started after the Zawiya ceasefire in September, when the United Nations support mission in Libya tried to introduce elements of the DDR, trying to avoid any destabilization of Tripoli, of the capital. The new interior minister, Fatih Bashagha, that was appointed after the reshuffle of the cabinet in October, worked together with the United Nations mission in Libya and tried to implement these new security arrangements. This replaced the previous security arrangements that didn't work, and cornerstone was the establishment of a new military force that was the Presidential Guard. The Presidential Guard, led by Colonel Nakwa, remained ineffective and subjugated to the militia cartel. The new security arrangements try to replace irregular militias and armed groups with regular police forces. There were several attempts in October through the evacuation of military bases, the fact that the GNA was able to take control of the Tripoli port. They also asked the Special Deterrence Force to leave the Mitiga air base. However, the limits of this strategy were shown in the following months after a series of high-profile assassinations in Tripoli and a new outburst of violence in the capital in January. The terrorist attack in December in Tripoli also forced Fatih Bashagha, the Minister of Interior, to paint a bleak picture of the situation. He complained about the lack of funds. He said that there was a chaotic security situation in Tripoli, and he also accused militias of being responsible for the clashes and to make a parallel interior ministry inside the capital. There were other efforts to stabilize the situation in Libya. We can mention NATO, for example. They offered to rebuild the security apparatus in Libya. The Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that his focus would be on the Ministry of Interior and on the Ministry of Defense, but NATO's offer overlapped with the Egyptian mediation effort because Egypt was trying to mediate to reunify the Libyan army through a series of talks in Cairo. The last round of talks was in October, and there was an agreement that was reached to establish several military councils. However, Haftar's role in the future Libyan military proved once again divisive, as after reports emerged about Haftar giving a leading role in the future Libyan military, the Presidency Council was forced to deny that an agreement was reached, and there was strong resistance also from Misrata militias and from the Operation Bunyan al-Marsus, solid structure that defeated ISIS in Sirte in 2016. They rejected the Egyptian mediation effort and accused Egypt of being biased towards Haftar.
Thank you. And all of these international efforts are made a lot more complicated by the number of competing regional agendas involved. The EU is involved, the US Africa Command is involved, Russia is involved, and of course there are the myriad interests of Libya's Arab and African neighbours. So what is going to come of these differing regional priorities amidst all of these efforts?
Sure. I think I will leave the Gulf area to Emile, but it's clear that the Libya conflict is a source of instability for neighboring countries. We briefly mentioned Egypt before. We need to contextualize Egypt's role in the conflict. For Egypt, the fight against terrorism is obviously a priority. The country has suffered from increasing terrorist attacks, not only in the restive Sinai Peninsula, but also in the Western Desert. There was an episode that shed lights on Egypt's role in Libya and the connection with counterterrorism. It was the attack in Minya in May 2017 against Coptic Christians, and Egypt accused militants based in Libya of being responsible for that attack. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi ordered airstrikes against militants in Derna that was under the control of the Derna Mujahideen Shura Council, despite the fact that the attack in Minya was claimed by ISIS. Recently, an arrest in Derna made by the LNA corroborated Egypt's assumption. The terrorist arrested was an Egyptian national. His name is Hisham al-Ashmawi, and was the leader of the Al-Bum Rabitoun group. It was responsible, according to Egypt, for several attacks against Egyptian targets in the Egyptian territory. After this attack, Egypt also carried out further airstrikes, not only in Derna but also in Jufra, where the Libyan National Army was losing ground to Islamist militias after the Brak al-Shati massacre in May 2017, where at least 100 LNA fighters were killed by the Third Force, the Misurata Third Force, and the Benghazi Defense Brigades. These airstrikes allowed the LNA to regain position in Jufra and to take control of the Jufra airbase. It is interesting to note that the reaction of neighboring countries to these airstrikes, because Algeria, for example, put its ground troops on high alert after the Egyptian airstrikes. This is because Algeria interpreted these attacks as a violation of the Tunis Declaration that was signed in February 2017 by the Foreign Ministry of Algeria, Egypt, and Tunisia. Of course, the recent offensive of the LNA in southern Libya, it's also good to be, it had a good timing because it's an electoral year for Tunisia, it's an electoral year for Algeria, and after the recent accusation by Haftar against Algeria last summer, this gave Haftar the possibility to take advantage of the Algeria's paralysis and to advance towards the southern and the western part of the country.
Thank you. So the international community has a number of different plans for Libya coming up this year, including the national conference that's supposed to be taking place in the next few weeks, as well as the broader UN action plan and plans for elections. What outcomes would you expect from all of these initiatives?
I think that we have to put things in perspective. The UN action plan that was presented by Salameh in 2017 was based on 4 main points, and these were amendments to the Libyan political agreement, a national conference, the election law and the referendum law for the draft constitution, and presidential and general elections to be held soon. The dilatory attitude of the several Libyan bodies, the HOR or also the High Council of State, forced Salameh to adopt a flexible approach, trying to implement the points that were possible to implement. This plan also overlapped with several other initiatives by other countries. For example, the plan was presented after the meeting in La Celle-Saint-Claude near Paris, where Haftar and Sarraj agreed on a ceasefire with the relevant exception of the fight against terrorist groups in Libya and elections to be held soon. A clear timetable was also set after another meeting in Paris in May 2018 with a constitutional basis. It was a vague formula to govern relations between institutions in Libya to be agreed by the 16th of September, and elections to be held on the 10th of December 2018. The fighting in Tripoli and the spat between, the rivalry between Italy and France over the peace process negotiations in Libya caused another postponement. Right now, after the meeting in Abu Dhabi, it seems that they agreed to end the transitional phase through elections. It is a general formula. So for the moment, I think that there was no mention of the national conference, of course, And this is particularly important because to solve the crisis in Libya, it needs probably a bottom-up approach would be favorable that relies on cities, on the local dimension, and the national conference could be helpful to try to get the solution to the Libyan crisis.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to excuse me. I'm now going to pass over to Emile and ask him to please explain what you think the main regional trends, especially those coming out of the Middle East, are going to mean for Libya's political future.
Thank you, Nella, and thank you for reminding the audience of my parents' greatest disappointment in me, my absence of, my lack of PhD.
Sorry.
I make up for it with my great looks, but no, apologies. When you study Middle East conflicts, you have to resort to, bad humor to, keep up with the misery in the region. The point. I am certainly no North Africa or Libya analyst, so I look at this in the framework of regional competition and the kind of international involvement that regional competition invites. And Libya is a great case because the outcome in Libya is not going to have a fundamental impact on the regional balance of power. Libya doesn't sit at is not a powerful consolidated state that if you somehow capture it or it falls on your side, your regional power somehow explodes. It's one of those fights that exist because of legacy involvements that are perpetuated because regional actors at some point invested in certain networks in a certain set of interests. And then the fight continues without necessarily being, really central to those various, and I'll qualify this in a second, but to those various actors. So I would argue that in a way that's a tragedy of Libya. The way this ends is not going to, it will be hopefully good for the Libyan people, hopefully will be good in terms of counterterrorism, in terms of management of migration trends, etc. But it's not going to have a massive impact on the Middle Eastern balance of power. And in a way, this is why it's so puzzling to see so many regional actors so massively invested in it. So you can make, and we'll make that case, and as Umberto mentioned before, that it's actually quite important in terms of Egypt, for instance. It's a direct security issue. But when it comes to the UAE and Qatar, for instance, which are other Gulf states are massively, or were massively involved in that, I think their level of involvement is varying. It's very different. They are there because the other one is there, and the other one won't cave. So first, Libya is one of the arenas where, regional involvement is an exacerbating factor. One can conceptually imagine a way where actually regional involvement helps to fix the situation, but somehow it never really works. There needs to be a development on the battlefield that helps actors reposition themselves. The second point I would make about the fighting in the Libya is that the fight against ISIS or terrorism in general doesn't necessarily have the unifying effect that international actors would like it to believe, right? I mean, this is true in Syria, in Iraq, in other places. The fact that you're fighting this one big jihadi monster that everyone agrees needs to be defeated doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to fall in place and prioritize that and in the process, define down their objectives. And the third point here that I would like to make is that the UN processes can easily be hijacked or overtaken by battlefield developments or by the ability of one side to just get that score that victory on the battlefield that in a way changes the narratives or forces the various UN envoys to adjust to that reality. We saw this in Syria. We see this in Yemen to some extent. And I think Libya is a place where there is uncertainty. If Haftar somehow and his forces really manage to drive or get closer to Tripoli, are Salam's efforts really going to be what sets the global discussion on Libya? Now, to zoom in a bit on the point about regional competition, I mean, Libya was, in a way, one of the key arenas where, the big divide in the Middle East between, on one hand, Egypt, UAE, and the other, Qatar and Turkey, was unfolding. And again, yes, it was driven by strategic interests, by ideology, but I would argue that it's also driven by legacy interests, that you have invested in a certain set of actors, and your interest is to have a return on that involvement. You are going to stick by these individuals for as much as you can. I would argue today that the edge is certainly in favor of the UAE and Egypt in this competition. I mean, the coalition they support, the LNA and Haftar and so on, is more coherent and more capable than the opposing coalition. It doesn't mean that it is coherent or capable, that it's more coherent than the others. And that has an impact in how policymakers think about it. Certainly Sarraj doesn't help himself and is not helped by the coalition that supposedly fights in support of the UN-backed government. And this, I think, that edge is only going to get clearer. I think first Egypt, by mere virtue of its geographical proximity, cannot disengage and will not disengage. And we saw the Egyptians do things, in terms of air support, in terms of material support, and so on, that were, that we didn't think they would take at some point, and then suddenly they seem quite committed. They see this. The second thing is, for the UAE in particular, the alignment with France and Russia is an important one. I think they're not out there in the cold. They are actually, there is a political agreement with two quite powerful actors that happen to sit on the Security Council and can steer the UN discussion on that. And at the same time, I would argue that, interestingly enough, a country like the UAE has been nimble enough, right? The Sarraj-Haftar meeting in Abu Dhabi shows that if you achieve some success on the battlefield, but you're smart enough to play diplomatically, you look good. You look like the magnanimous actor and so on. And I'm not saying that those meetings necessarily result in something substantial, but that's quite telling, right? That they didn't totally ostracize and froze Sarraj and say, you're on the other side, we're not going to engage you. Actually, you playing it smartly helps. And I would argue that at the same time, and I'll stop after this, at the same time, what we've seen is both Turkey and Qatar basically rethink part of their regional involvement. I mean, there is a degree of retrenchment both in Doha and Turkey because of setbacks that they have suffered, because of more important priorities, which means that the Turks and the Qataris are certainly not investing in the outcome in Libya today the way they had been in the past. I'm curious if Umberto accepts that. Look, ultimately, the thing about Libya is because of the type of war economy that there is, because the war itself generates enough revenue, it's a relatively rich country, because of how the French and the Italians have been present, it's not the regional divisions or the regional competition that explains why the conflict lasts, right? So there is a danger in overemphasizing that angle. I would argue that in Syria, it was in a way the opposite, because it was a resource-poor country, because it was surrounded by so many important and very involved governments around it. So in Libya, it's both a curse and possibly a blessing at one point. It really depends on the ability of policymakers to define down their objectives.
Great, thank you so much, Emile. So I'm now going to open the floor to questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and state your name and affiliation, and please wait for the roving mic to come to you. We do have a big audience, so if I could please ask you all to keep your questions short and concise. Thank you.
Khalid Nazim, South Asian Middle East Forum. I haven't heard you mention Italy. I'm interested to know what the impact of the Libya crisis is today on refugees flowing to Italy, because this was a big problem. I've heard from Italian diplomats. And even some time ago when I visited Rome and went to the foreign ministry, they were saying this is a big problem for us. So what is the situation with refugees and Italy, and what is the role of Italy in Libya at the moment? What are they actually doing? And secondly, I'd like to know what's happening in Sirte. Has that calmed down? There's a situation, is that a bedrock of Gaddafi rivalry, or what's happened to save Gaddafi? What's his role in Libya today?
Thank you.
Okay. You didn't hear about Italy because I'm Italian, so I don't want to get involved.
And I'm French, so we can actually fight that one.
Well, I think that the impact of the refugee flows, the migrant flows along the central Mediterranean routes has actually decreased. It has been probably overplayed by the extremist far-right movements, populist movements that have taken, they are now in government in Rome. We had a crisis probably in 2016. We had 180,000 arrivals from Libya along the central Mediterranean routes. But right now, after the externalization policy and the criminalizations of NGOs, last year the arrivals were about 23,000. So the numbers have decreased, and there is probably, Italy has three main interests in Libya. They said that are the migrant flows, energy, of course, and security. And this gives us an idea about how Italy looks to Libya through a security lens. Everything is based on security. There's been not so much engagement in the political resolution of the conflict. They only made an attempt in November with the Palermo conference, but it was just a reaction to the French initiatives in Paris, and had also controversial results because it empowered General Khalifa Haftar, that is at odds with Italy, and was also able to obtain the replacement of the former ambassador. The second question was about Sirte and Gaddafi. Well, it's interesting to see Sirte right now. There were reports about the fact that the National Conference could have taken place in Sirte, and this was denied because probably UN envoy Ghassan Salameh didn't want the conference to take place in a city where there are a lot of Gaddafi supporters. At the same time, we also didn't discuss about the role of Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, for example, that has recently emerged and has reached out to powerful actors in the Libyan context, for example, Russia. And the role of Russia about Libya, many says that is just to rely on General Khalifa Haftar, but we don't have to forget that it has also relations with the government of national accord, and has also said that Saif al-Islam Gaddafi has the right to run in the next presidential election. So for me, Russia is trying to leave all the cards on the table and to profit as much as possible from the from the situation on the ground in Libya.
Just a quick question, Andrew Chi from IISS. The question is in relation to Haftar's advancement towards the south, and whether you feel this advancement on towards the oil fields will have an impact on the global markets.
sorry, do you want to take that one
Yes,
now, and
yes,
then I'll take another one
course.
afterwards?
The impact. I think that to answer to your question, we have to see that there was a lot of negotiation going between Haftar and Mustafa Sanalla. This is the chairman of the National Oil Corporation. The LNA took control of the Sharara oil field, that is the largest oil field in southern Libya, with a production capacity of 315 barrels per day. But Sanalla was a bit, he didn't want to immediately open the oil field, probably because he wanted to have reassurance about that. Right now, I think that the game now is try to do what he did with the oil crescent region. It means to have control of the oil fields, but let the revenues flow goes directly to the central bank of Libya in Tripoli, and not to the central bank of Libya in Baida. Every time there is tension in Libya, there is always re-emerges the question of the parallel institutions, but powerful actors, for example, the United States, probably don't have interest in having, after autonomously exporting oil from the eastern part of the country.
Thank you. I'm seeing two questions here, so we'll take the gentleman at the front and this gentleman here. You first, sir, please.
Thank you. Sami Zabtia, editor, Libya Herald. Continuing your line of thought and thesis that Egypt shares a border with Libya and therefore is not going to let go, it's not a luxury it can afford, whereas maybe Qatar, Turkey, etc. can. And if we agree that Haftar is an extension of Egyptian policy or helping implement it, and if we agree that Haftar on the ground is the fait accompli now, I mean, he's established himself, and he claims we control 3/4 or 90%, all sorts of figures they throw at the LNA. My argument is, should the people like the Italians, who are not engaging politically but are purely looking at it from Security Council, is it not better for them to engage with Haftar now if we agree that he's a reality on the ground? And my argument is that they are the ones who are leaving this vacuum for him to operate militarily, and rather than engaging with him politically. I'd like to hear either of your views on this, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. And can we take that question over there, sir?
Yeah, I'm Bruce Stanley from Richmond University here in London. I'm interested in particular in questions of policing and prisons, both formal and informal prisons, and in the context of security sector reform. We know that there are large amount of torture, people disappearing. We know that there are informal prisons in the south. Could you comment somewhat about that aspect of security sector reform?
Just quickly on the issue of Haftar and say, I mean, first, I shouldn't. Haftar is a partner of Egypt, right? Like he is a partner of the UAE and others. The study of those kinds of relationships suggests that very often the partner ends up disappointing the sponsor, or the ally, etc. In terms of their capability, I mean, in terms of their ability to govern or build a security sector and so on. So, and what's actually interesting is that a number of actors are hedging. They're not necessarily giving Haftar the full benefit of the doubt. I was just reading some reporting about Haftar's southern advance, and actually it was quite a smart, nimble approach where it wasn't necessarily like some large advancing column, but it was really co-opting and picking allies on the ground. It's largely because money was spreading, but also because people wanted to believe that there was some kind of order coming. So those kind of narratives are powerful. What I'm trying to get to here is that Haftar's interests don't necessarily fully align with those of his partners. In that sense, he needs the regional support, he needs the international legitimacy and so on that they bring. In terms of international engagement, I mean, no one is denying, including the UN and so on, that whether it's Haftar or others, they're going to be part of a solution. I haven't seen anyone totally vetoing that. It's a very different situation than settlement in Syria or elsewhere, where the considerations are very different. The fact that the French give such a high profile to Haftar, the fact that others say, shows that you can't really ignore that. The question is whether, and going back to what Umberto said, is that whether he should be the cornerstone of whatever security or political arrangement comes. And if so, a year ago when he was sick, there was you remember, there was a number of pieces saying, that's it, he's exiting the scene, the whole thing is going to collapse, and then no, he wasn't sick or dead for that matter. He's back. He's actually even more ambitious and more driven than before. But perhaps this whole LNA structure that he has is not as coherent and cohesive, right? And can it be really the cornerstone of all that? In a way, it's kind of good if some countries remain a bit skeptical to actually get better conditions, a better settlement. A full embrace is not going to necessarily help at this point. At the same time, he's certainly the most powerful of the actors in Libya today. I don't know if Umberto would agree. So it's impossible to imagine a political settlement that doesn't give him a prominent role or more prominent than others.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that it seems the most powerful actor right now in Libya. But as you mentioned before, last year during this period, I think it was March or April, he got sick and he went to Paris. And at that time, we saw a lot of fissures emerging from the LNA. So it's not a cohesive structure as anybody could think about. It's called National Army, but it's mainly made by different tribal affiliates. And some of them could easily get at odds with him. One of the forces that are part of the Libyan National Army is the Saika Special Forces, and one of the leading commander of the Saika Special Forces, General Mahmoud al-Warfalli, has also received an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. He was arrested by Haftar, but managed to escape from prison, and the Saika forces supported Warfalli instead of Haftar. So the division inside the LNA could emerge at any time, I think.
Could you just address the question on policing in prisons as well as part of SSR?
Yes, I don't have so many elements about that. I think that probably the fact that most of the prisons are run not by the legitimate government, but are run by the militias, also contribute to the tortures and the inhuman and degraded treatment. I know a little bit more about the detention center for migrants. Some of them are also run by the militias and armed groups and not by the governmental forces. Right now we have about 800,000 migrants held in Libya. Only 20,000 of them are held in detention centers run by the government. And this is just the result of the EU and Italy's externalization policy.
Thank you. So I see two questions here at the moment. This gentleman at the front and you, sir, around the side. Would you like to go first, sir?
Hi. My name is Nasser Salem. I'm a lawyer from Libya. So today is the 19th of March. 8 years ago, the same this day, international community start military operation in Libya. They promised Libya that we are bringing you a great future. After that, we found out that there is no plan for after Gaddafi regime collapsed. So the question is, I don't know why the international community don't like to see the fact in the ground. Libyans nowadays don't like to deal with the same faces in Libya. The same faces, the same people, 8 years, corrupted people. We just need new faces, and I don't know why the international community deal with the new people. Because that many people in Libya nowadays, they say, we prefer to deal with Saif al-Islam Gaddafi or Khalifa Haftar than dealing with the same people. Thank you.
Paul?
My question really is about the emerging geometry, if there is one, of Western involvement. Western special forces and air power was involved in overthrowing Gaddafi and didn't go away, although it's not talked about very much. Certainly contingents from Britain, France, America, Italy, I think, and others were and probably still are on the ground. NATO has said it is turning to the south. It's going to do more in trying to bring strategic stability to its south. Do you have any sense of how this might actually be applied? It seems impossible to discuss this openly within NATO, presumably because there are so many competing national agendas for Libya. So and yet it can't be a matter of indifference to NATO countries. So what is going to happen? How will the engagement unfold? Or will it become chaotic and eventually discouraged?
Would you like to start with it?
Yes, with this question. Actually, I think that you're right. I mean, after 8 years, we have noticed that we have the same political players, and many of the institutional bodies have also extended their mandate even beyond their limit. Right now, we have municipal elections that could take place in the next months in Libya, and this is a good opportunity for a fresh restart, because renewing municipal council, for example, could be an opportunity to see new faces and to have a renewment of the political representatives in Libya. At the national level, everything will be decided, I think, on the military, especially if the LNA's offensive would continue and the General Haftar finally get to Tripoli, as he always threatened many times. But right now I think that at the national level, the international partners, let's call it like that, have invested so much political capital on these political players to just abandon them. On the other question, I think that right now in NATO we have, as I said before, we have the opportunity to engage Libya in reform of its security sector. Defense Ministry, Interior Ministry, Stoltenberg said that there is no opportunity for a training mission on the ground. And as I said before, this initiative is overlapping with the Egyptian mediation effort. And as I said also to the gentleman here in front, everything will be decided on the ground, because if Haftar gets to Tripoli and if he complete the conquest of Libya, I think that the option of a security reform initiated by Egypt, with the cooperation of Egypt, will be the most preferable option for the next Libyan government.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more questions? All right, well, in that case, I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask one. Elections tend to be considered as the sort of marker of a successful transition, and they're something that have been trumpeted a lot as a possibility for Libya. You mentioned the municipal elections. What are the chances of a national election, and what kind of, I was wondering if you could dig in a little bit more as to whether or not you think national elections are a realistic possibility, and what they might actually bring to Libya. Is it the transition that would obviously be hoped for, or would this be a double-edged sword?
Well, I mean, as a non-Libya analyst, the one thing I remember is that Libya had several elections, 2012 to 2014. Elections in and of themselves, are certainly not the solution. They have to cap a process, then just be the beginning or the totality of a process. Elections are often, just because they're very visible because you sometimes have a big result. They tend to be a preference and you want processes and so on, but they often don't necessarily deliver the kind of results that one wants. I mean, not just elections, referendums and others, they can actually create a lot more distortion than others. It's certainly not the case. But I mean, someone like Hassan Salami or others are aware of that history. I'll let Umberto talk about how realistic it is politically and operationally to do that. You need to have a serious work up front to at least agree on what comes in the steps after an election. Otherwise, if anything, you open a new phase in a conflict.
Yes, absolutely agree with that. And we have also to remind that to have elections, we need money. And right now, the election commissions in Libya has always complained about the lack of funding from the government of national accord. And the fact that there are also the security conditions are not good. There is fighting ongoing in the southern part of the country. There is a state of tensions in Sirte. There is the threat from the Islamic State that last year also said that it will disrupt the elections in Libya and in other countries. I think that right now going to elections could be divisive. And instead, I would prefer to adopt a bottom-up approach. As I said, the National Conference is a practical solution. It could rely on the local dimension that in Libya is really important and has also provided basic services to the population. Let's not forget about the tribes, the role that they played, the Council of Elders. They were an element of stabilizations in Libya compared to what the other institutions, the national institutions, were.
Great. We have one more question at the front, sir.
Yes, sorry, Jonathan Shaw, 32 years in the military. Just in answer to your question, I'm pretty sure that the special forces that are down there have nothing to do with internal politics in Libya and everything to do with the fight against ISIS. So, don't confuse the two. And one of the reasons they're divorced is because Britain, as far as I can see, although I turn to David for a counter view, we don't have a policy on it. I don't detect a policy on it at all. And we revert back to our sort of standard, dare I say it, sort of neo-colonial idea of imposing elections and free thought. We're imposing Western standards on a country that, frankly, without wishing to sound too like Christopher Coker in his recent book about civilization states, is just totally inappropriate to this country. And I completely agree with the question of my friend sat next to me here who was talking about Haftar taking over, and perhaps that's the best model. And, the questions about DDR and the questions about security sector reform, these are all pretty pie in the sky in relation to this country. I'm afraid it's so far off the spectre that we are, I fear, applying the wrong analytic tools to Libya. And I'm grateful for the very honest view that I got from the two presenters today about what a shambles Libya's in and how, in fact, it's getting worse, because there are people who take a much more sort of optimistic view, saying it's all going to be fine. It isn't going to be fine, and as long as we keep imagining that this place is going to develop as we in the West would wish it, we are deluding ourselves. And I actually agree with your question that Haftar and his increasing takeover, if he's the big stick that can unite the country and actually create some stability, that's probably, I would argue, a good thing. That's not a question, it's a comment. Having been involved in so many of these so-called regime changes, they inevitably end up worse than you began with.
Do we have an... Yes.
Thank you for agreeing with us, but I'll disagree with you. I think there's a danger here, which is that you have a mess, and suddenly we build in our heads that a military strongman is somehow the response. There's no, history shows us that regime change, whether it's internal or externally driven, doesn't necessarily work, but history also tells us that military strongmen don't have a good record at governance or stabilization, for that matter. So the danger today is to veer in the totally different direction. It's one thing to say that Haftar has to be part of an agreement, but if it comes down to another military strongman and so on, no, you're just delaying and possibly making the situation much worse over time. We have to consider that element. And I think it's very important. It's like, at some points we get tired with the fighting, we don't know what to do, it's all very complex, we don't want to do conflict management, therefore in our heads and conceptually we decide that there's somehow one individual somewhere who can do this, right? Just as, you know, it was the case of Syria. Oh, okay, let's Assad have rule it all, why did we jump into that? As if those individuals were not involved in creating and fostering the conditions that got there. So I'm very worried about this tendency today to embrace the concept of strongmen. With, you know, the military, there's a reason why there's healthy civil-military relations in this country and others, right? Because, you know, you may be great on the battlefield operationally and so on, but I don't want you to do governance as a civilian. Pardon, I don't know, would you want to do governance? Exactly, we agree on that one. So, no, but my point is more profound, is that you look at the governance in Egypt and other places. Yes, it looks stable until it's not. And then look at Algeria, you know, just next door. We've known for 5 years that you had a presidential election coming, and yet that sclerotic system could only decide to renew, to put back a 85-year-old who perhaps can't speak back on the ballot box. Those systems need to be flexible. They don't necessarily need to be fully democratic and so on, but they at least have to be responsive. And it's very difficult to tell whether this new generation of military commanders and would-be rulers can show that magnanimity and that flexibility. Count me as skeptical.
Great, thank you. Do we have any more questions? I think we have time for one more. So we're a gentleman in the middle over there. Actually, we have one more over here as well, a gentleman with the glasses. Tom,
Thanks very much. Lenny Brown, Royal Marines, Royal College of Defence Studies. I just wondered, since the chaos, the divisions in Libya, that we won't ever see a unified Libya again. And perhaps you might be able to describe a future Libya that might be partitioned in some way.
Great, thank you. And can you take the question? Yusuf, thank you.
Patrick Winter from The Guardian. There's just two small factual questions. One, is there any possibility that some of the militias in Tripoli may switch sides and join Haftar? You've talked a lot about the divisions within the militia. And then secondly, it was at an earlier event about Libya, and there was some talk about the need for America to fill the vacuum, and yet I think, as you said, there's maybe no great strategic interest for seen in Libya, and is there any evidence that America would raise its stick on this issue?
Okay. Yes, about the... I think that that's a question for the Libyans. I mean, probably the outcome of the consultation process for the National Conference gave a clear picture. Libyans want a united country. They don't want to be partitioned, despite the fact that there are regional interests ongoing and there is a regional dynamic ongoing, and probably if the division continues, the risk is higher. But the consultations that have been made for the National Conference in the results gave a majority of Libyans saying that they want a united country. The problem right now is probably the fact that, as I said before, there are, nobody keeps noticing that, but Libya is in the middle of two powerhouses that are Algeria and Egypt. Of course, Egypt knows that any further push westwards from Haftar towards Algiers is a risk. And probably they also tried to refrain Haftar from going towards Tripoli. There were several reports saying that also the United States has tried to put a stop to Haftar advance towards Tripoli, because there is a risk of a generalized conflict, a re-edition of the 2014 conflict in the country. About the militias, yes, it's absolutely right. I mean, if we look at that, we have seen that many of the militias have switched sides, and they can switch sides at any time. It depends on their interests, their particular interest, and there are, of course, strong resistance about Haftar, especially from Misrata, but more recently, also the Minister of Interior, Bashaga, made an opening towards Haftar. So despite these conciliatory approaches, I think that there will be strong resistance in Misrata, but at the same time in Tripoli things can change at any time.
On the U.S. role, quickly, I mean, we've really entered a new era. You know, as you know, the U.S. may be needed or not. We may agree on the merits or the wisdom of, you know, a role and so on. I just think the debate in Washington has moved, far beyond that. Look, I mean, just referring to the gentleman's point earlier, the debate back in 2011, 2012 was whether the U.S. and its, European allies needed to be more engaged in Libya during the transition, and back then, what we heard from Libyans was, no, let us own this process. We'll figure this out. To the contrary, a light touch is the better way to go. So you have 2 years during which you have lots of politics, you have lots of wrangling and so on, but you don't have necessarily intense violence. And then everything starts collapsing in 2014. And then the debate in Western capitals is like, oh, perhaps we should have been more involved. We should have done more post-conflict planning, etc., forgetting that actually a healthy number of Libyans at the time were not in favor of that. To the contrary, right? They were worried that this would somehow poison the image of the revolution or dynamics and so on. Today, it's very difficult to see what the entry point for the U.S. Would be. I mean, do they fully embrace the Libyan, the Italian position or the French one, or they wait until they see who wins in Tripoli and then they embrace whoever is the winner there? I mean, first, I think with Trump as president, it's very unlikely he wants to disengage from the region altogether, despite all the talk now and then and so on. I think that's his perspective. Why be engaged there? It's bad for us, and certainly they don't deserve us as well. I mean, there's this element there. But also, if you look at the political discussion, the foreign policy discussion in the U.S., the centrist, I would say, not interventionists, I hate that word, but those who think that countries like the US could and should do more, they're really on the back foot, even within the Democratic Party. They're not talking about, the foreign policy progressive agenda is actually about retrenching and doing less and so on. So I don't think it's realistic. We may talk about whether it's needed, or there are ways of doing it and so on, but I think that's divorced from the political discussion.
Great, thank you. I think we'll have to draw it to a close there because we are running low on time, but thank you all so much for coming, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.